This is what we call the Red Threads. We're going to be taking you through the highlights of what happened on this second day under the theme Nutrition and Health. We're also going to be joined very shortly by some very special guests to continue our discussion on how healthy food can lead to healthy cities. Now, each day of the summit is dedicated to a specific theme. Yesterday was resilience. Today, like I said, nutrition and health. On Thursday will be markets and trade. Friday, food systems. Today, governments, the civil society, the private sector, research community, and development partners dedicated their theme to reflect on nutrition and health. Now, in Africa, the COVID-19 pandemic's impacts underline the critical need to ensure ready, available, affordable, nutritious food for everyone so that they can remain healthy, productive, and resilient in the face of such shocks. Joining me now from literally across the planet, we're going to be talking to experts who will bring this down, bring this home, the theme of nutrition and health. We're going to start on my top left, where we find Dr. Robert Bertram. He's the chief scientist, the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID. He joins us from Maine in the USA. Right next to him is Dr. Gunhild Stordalen, founder, executive chair, EAT. She's in Oslo, Norway. Bottom left is Dr. Claudia Sadov. She's a managing director, Consultative Group on International Agricultural Research, or CGR. And bottom right is Enoch Chikava. He's deputy director, Agricultural Development, Global Growth and Opportunity for the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Folks, if you can hear me, welcome to the Red Threads, welcome to Kigali, and thanks so much for your time. If I can begin with you, Enoch Chikava, because let's face it, I've read your story. You grew up in a small household, small farming, if you will, smallholder. Enoch, in this day and age, when you look back, smallholder, and we're talking about nutrition, we're talking about good food, we're talking about healthy folks. It is difficult because you've come from that tough background. It is difficult telling people eat healthy when they just want to eat for the sake of, a meal a day or whatever.
Yes, Jeff. So it's very important to start at the farm level because smallholder farmers need and want the same things as we do. They want nutritious food, they want health care, they want, more importantly, school fees, because the way out of poverty for every smallholder farmer may not be farming as such. Agriculture is just the springboard. It is just a strong foundation, but you should be able to generate sufficient income for you to have the school fees. So what I've learned is that, they need the same things as we do. But again, if you look at the nutrition, there's normally, the feeling or maybe the thinking that those on the farm, they produce everything they need to eat. But it's not entirely correct. Smallholder farmers are also consumers. And today, if we're going to look at a basic diet, it will cost you about $2 a day. But if you want a healthy diet, it's $4 per day. So any person earning $1.90 per day, which is again the poverty threshold, is not able to afford even a basic diet, and let alone the healthy diet that is recommended, which everyone deserves.
Yeah.
So there is this exchange between urban and rural, but more importantly, we need to make sure that at the farm level, we are talking of production, but also consumption. So this now bleeds into what the smallholder farmers grow on the farm. Do you eat what you produce and that's sufficient? Or you need to be more aware about what I don't have on the farm, I need to find income to get also maybe from cities. So as I said, there's this exchange between rural and urban, and some foods move into the urban centers, and also backwards, you bring some of the food also coming from the urban centers.
All right, Enoch, hold that thought, because that will take us straight to Norway, where I find Dr. Gunhild Stordalen. Now, EAT, your organization, is a science-based global platform for food system transformation, which is very much in line with what we heard this afternoon at the talk. What do you think should be the top 3 priorities for action to overcome the lack of knowledge on nutritious and healthy food among consumers, in particular young consumers?
Well, good evening, everybody, and thanks for that important question. So let me start by saying that knowledge and information is not enough, because our food choices depend on so much more than knowledge, from taste, price, availability, we just heard, and also culture and social norms, etc. So the shift to healthy, sustainable consumption will require coordinated efforts across sectors, everything from change in government policy and of course supply side innovation, but also better information and education, and also measures to shift consumer demands and get people to aspire to better food. So in terms of priority actions, I would say 4. I would say start with public procurement and start with schools. Not only are school feeding programs important, cooking classes, but we also must start integrating the study of food systems, how food, health, climate, environment, social equity, all are connected, and get that into the school curriculums. Second, dietary guidelines are really important for both for guiding policymakers and health professionals in educating consumers. But many countries still lack such guidelines, and existing guidelines must be updated based on the best available science and integrate both health and sustainability considerations, but particularly for regional foods. Third, we need better food labeling, and we also need to explore new digital tools such as apps that makes it easier for people to know where their food products come from, their sustainability impacts, and of course nutritional value. And we have to find solutions here that can be effective also for low income groups. And fourth, that is really important, we need to work with chefs and behavioral and marketing experts, because people need much more than knowledge again. They need to see and taste and experience what we are asking of them to adopt. And it has to be aspirational. And Africa is of course no exception. And indeed, Africa's diversity of foods can and will not only be a solution for Africa, but for people around the world. And we are already seeing how great chefs like Pierre Thiam from Senegal is making fonio a household name in the States, and how Michael Elegbede from Nigeria is bringing Nigeria's culinary traditions to light. And this is also education. And finally, coming back to the issue of information, I think we have to look at information as a two-way street, because it's critical to learn from people out there, and especially the most excluded and vulnerable, what their realities, concerns, views, and demands are, and really bring their realities and bring their voices much more in direct contact with those actors working on solutions, or even more broadly on the policies and the practices that affect them. So how do we do that? Well, I would say that one avenue to focus on here is to partner with mobile telecom providers and get their help in generating data and intel, get views, concerns, demands from the grassroots level that can help inform improved policies and developing better solutions.
Okay, let's go to San Francisco, California. Dr. Claudia Sadov, you've heard the comments just then, but if it was any other year, Dr. Sadov, if it was any other year, you'd say, okay, Africa could be rounding the corner. Despite climate change, despite droughts, despite famines, Africa could be rounding the corner. But then came COVID-19. Then the world literally stopped. and Africans who were depending on maybe a couple of meals a day, or as Enoch said, maybe $2 a day. Now it becomes a whole new ballgame, Dr. Claudia. Your thoughts, how do we move from here? And without even getting to the nutritious level, how do we move?
Thank you, Jeff. I don't think anyone could have foreseen the locusts or the COVID of this year and the additional challenges that farmers across Africa are facing. What we do know, though, is that climate change is with us and that it's deeply disruptive. And so it really just reinforces the fact that we need to look very carefully at resilience and sustainability, the resilience both of agricultural production, but also the livelihoods of farmers, farm families, farm communities. If we look primarily at climate, we also see great opportunity. We need to really work together on mitigation in agriculture, because we know that agriculture and food systems produce about a third of global greenhouse gas emissions, where agriculture could be a global carbon sink. But perhaps more pressingly is the issue of working together around adaptation and resilience that we hope would extend beyond climate impacts to other unforeseen disruptions that farmers face. In sub-Saharan Africa, 95% of farmed land is rain-fed. And this leaves Africa's small-scale farmers, the overwhelming majority of farmers on the continent, particularly vulnerable to rainfall uncertainties, to drought, and to livelihood disruptions. So what can be done for them? At CGIR, we're working with African partners across the continent on a number of different work streams. We're working to provide, for example, better predictions and advisories of disruptions that farmers may face. So we're using advanced technologies to strengthen drought monitoring and predictions, for example, finding better ways to make these predictions and also to communicate and deliver these predictions and advisories to farmers who need them. We're working with farmers to prepare for climate shocks, droughts, disruptions, uncertainties, and rainfall. We do this by more holistic and modernized breeding programs that can deliver seeds that are more drought and heat tolerant, provide greater nutrition, productivity, and that are better aligned actually with market preferences as well to ensure safeguarding of livelihoods. We support preparation for these uncertainties and disruptions through more climate-smart agricultural water management, because water will be the way in which many farmers immediately experience climate disruptions. So we help to try to deliver small-scale farmer-led irrigation. We try to enhance the opportunities for water storage across the continent, both nature-based storage and engineered solutions to store water in rivers, reservoirs, aquifers, but also landscapes and soils. We work to raise the productivity of water in both rain-fed and irrigated dryland agriculture, and to share data. And this is something Dr. Stoordalen was speaking about, data across all aspects of the food systems. We try to advance remote sensing capabilities, for example, like the work being done in Digital Earth Africa that helps us to understand our food, land, and water resources, the trends in these resources and the trade-offs. And we also are working with partners to help strengthen the response to these shocks, for example, through weather index-based insurance policies that can potentially be bundled with targeted packages of seeds, technical support, and advisory to strengthen the communities and their livelihoods. And it's important to say that all of these areas, all of these efforts require very broad partnerships of researchers across plant and animal science, water, forestry, land. It requires engineers and economists. It requires governments, entrepreneurs, and civil society all playing their roles in creating and delivering these resilience-enhancing solutions and services. And it also reminds us that we need to be mindful as we make these preparations for resilience. We need to be mindful of equity and inclusion and ensure that these solutions that we're creating are accessible and appropriate for different genders, different abilities, different ages, social, ethnic, and linguistic groups.
Yeah.
Because in addition to the biophysical and the economic realities and feasibilities that we work within, inclusivity is also a fundamental for truly resilient food systems.
Okay, hold that thought,
Truly resistant cities and societies. Thank you.
Hold that thought, Dr. Sadoff. Let's go to Maine, USA, where you find Dr. Robert Bertram. He's the chief scientist at the USAID. Now, Dr. Bertram, USAID has had a footprint in Africa, as you well know, for many years. Listen to the statistics, and you know them well. They say an estimated 60% of sub-Saharan Africans live in what can be termed as slums. More than 200 million children in urban areas grappling with extreme poverty. With the footprint you all have had on the ground, can we get out of that? Can we get out of that extreme poverty? Or is it one step forward, two steps backwards?
Thanks, Jeff. You've highlighted something that's actually kind of unique to Africa, a little bit different from what we saw in Asia. And that is that cities and towns actually grew faster than the countryside. There are some unfortunate aspects of that you've just alluded to. But what we've heard all day today is the question of affordability of food. And unfortunately, the foods that matter the most for nutrition, the fruits, the vegetables, the poultry, the eggs, the dairy, all of these, fish, these are the ones that are the least affordable to people living in those slums. So what is the answer for that? I think there are two things. We want to increase incomes and we want to make food more affordable. And unfortunately, we have a pathway in the African context where by linking rural smallholder producers with urban demand from the poor and maybe even from the middle class, we can offer economic opportunities to those in the rural areas, which, remember, it's the rural areas where extreme poverty and undernutrition, especially child stunting, are most concentrated. But it is an issue in the cities too. And we know how important quality, nutritious, affordable foods, that's been a recurrent theme today, is to meeting those needs. So how do we get at that? It's basically coming back to trying to increase productivity. Now, when I say productivity, I don't mean just production. I mean reducing loss and waste. I mean reducing the incidence of aflatoxin, preserving and adding value, making these fruits and vegetables and more perishable foods more affordable to low-income consumers in both rural and urban settings. So the answer to the city's problems, in significant part, lies in the rural areas. And certainly the answer to the poverty and child stunting and even environmental degradation issues in the rural areas is linked to connecting to the demand coming from the urban areas. So it's a huge win-win opportunity for Africa that checks a lot of boxes for us. And so it's a matter of helping rural communities and smallholders in particular enter into these higher nutrition value chains, things like fruits and vegetables. It's a lot harder growing those than it is growing maize. And the markets are much more sophisticated. But here's the upside. Those are also much more employment intensive value chains. And they're going to generate jobs for people on and off farm who move those foods safely to consumers in both urban and rural settings in ways that enhance their availability. We can also think about market infrastructure. And this is an issue in both cities and towns. You mentioned COVID before. We know that safe markets and clean markets is an important part of dealing with COVID, but it's also an important part longer term, Jeff, to enabling Africa's farmers to feed Africa's cities. So I hope that's a theme. I think that's come through today. Many comments about the needs in infrastructure and the needs for employment, and importantly, some of the gender roles that are going to be very significant in terms of how women link agricultural systems in the rural areas to food systems across the country and even across regions.
That's a good point there, Doctor. Thank you, especially about the women being the backbone of this continent. Let's go back to Oslo. And Dr. Stordalen, and you mentioned we have great chefs that have come out of this continent, but in recent years, we've gotten kind of spoiled and bought into the whole fast food thing. Fatty food, fried foods, and that's a bad habit. How do we get back on track? Because it's very attractive, for one, but we know that natural foods are the good foods, are the nutritious foods, but we buy into the whole fast food thing.
Well, that is a really good question. And obviously, I think we need to look at both on the demand side, how do we create demand for the real good foods, but also we need to look at policies and regulatory changes on the supply side, and we need to also work with governments and private money to invest in and innovate in new and better production practices. So again, I think this goes back to taking a systems approach. We cannot fix one piece of the puzzle. We need to look across. We need coherent policies and regulation that actually make it profitable for farmers and food producers to make the right foods, and obviously from access to markets and the infrastructures. It's not one single one silver bullet that can fix this. But on the demand side, I think, yeah, chefs are really important. They are designing tomorrow's menus, and we have also other influencers, athletes that can start promoting other things than fast foods.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's go all the way to Seattle, Washington, back to Enoch Chikava at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So Enoch, I'm sure being in Seattle, you can't resist a burger or two every now and then, or some French fries, I'm sure. How do you get out of the habit? Practice what you preach.
Well, I mean, the advantage is that if you spend maybe more than 30 years in Africa, which I did, you know that Africa is 55 countries. I've been to 38 of those. I spend the bulk of my time there. And also coming to the US here, you know, you can look for other, other shops that will be selling you food, which is similar to what you have in Africa. You go to the Caribbean shops, you go to some of the Indian shops and so on. But it is more of the culture. I'm sure when you move around with your culture. And that's why you have several cuisines. You can go into a Caribbean restaurant. You know, you can get into a Kenyan restaurant, even here in Seattle. You can have nyama choma here, actually. So really, you find that people move around with their food culture. And I'm sure this is the diversity that we need. If we can really provide people with all the opportunities and choices, and then fundamental to be building these choices is how connected will be those production sites and then the demand sites. And as you know, this delves now more into the data, the transparency in terms of, what do you know? What is being produced where, even informing the farmers. If I know that sesame is a good product, it will fetch me a better price on the market. Even though a farmer has been producing maize the rest of their lives, they will find opportunities of diversifying from what they're producing today. But as you know, Jeff, the challenge today is small-scale producers just don't have scale. It is difficult for you to aggregate so that you can begin to respond to huge demand which is coming out of the urban areas. And that's why the issue of data, the issue of analytics, turning that data into insights for decisions. And then if you have got platforms to make sure that the small scale producers in particular, they have these insights ahead of the season, then it will inform them now on what else to produce. I know this growing up on the farm is that if you lack information, you get into a lot of risks, across the board. You don't know what to plant, when to harvest, because you are doing this as a business. And unless you got those market signals, it will be very difficult for you to make decisions on the farm. So normally there's this progression. You need the data and analytics, which will give you the insights, which will then inform your decisions. And I think Africa at this stage, as you know, lacks a lot of good data.
Yeah.
And that affects the private sector in terms of investments as well as the government decisions.
Dr. Claudia Sadov, Enoch Chikava there just said something that a lot of speakers have been saying the last couple of days, emphasizing the need to scale up new technologies that can increase productivity and resilience in the agricultural sector. How?
Well, I think the really exciting opportunity lies in the next generation of farmers and in this marriage between agriculture and tech as we sort of look forward. I think that we're seeing great changes both in the consciousness around our food systems, around the way both producers and consumers are thinking about the food that they eat, where it comes from, what sort of nutrition it includes. But what we also are seeing increasingly is that innovation, which is the language of youth, is also very much the language of business. And agriculture needs to be seen as a focus for innovation. It needs to be seen not only as a viable sector, an attractive sector for the next generation, but a vibrant sector. We need to be thinking of agriculture as a primary driver of growth. We need to be thinking of it as an opportunity space for the application of new technologies, the upscaling and outscaling of new technologies. We need to be thinking of agriculture as a solution space for the challenges around nutrition, but also climate change and poverty and equity. AGRF has played really a key role in elevating the recognition of African agriculture as all of that, right? But how can we move that forward? How can we support the next generation of farmers and the creation of more agricultural entrepreneurs? Well, we can highlight opportunity. Foreign investment, foreign private sector investment in Africa food and agriculture was close to $50 billion between 2003 and 2017. I think we can encourage young scientists to challenge them to find and develop new seeds and new land, water, and soil management systems that are more resilient and more sustainable. I think we can challenge our young engineers to build better green and gray systems that leverage natural capital and build more circular economies that can help us to recycle urban wastewater and food waste and turn those urban waste streams into resource streams that help us to remove hazards from the environment and return water, nutrients, and energy back into the safe use in agriculture to really reimagine the connectivity between our urban and rural food and waste systems. I think we can challenge young tech experts to try to find ways to apply advances in AI, machine learning, big data in novel ways to agriculture and challenge entrepreneurs to create new services and business models. But in the more immediate term, we can also challenge our own organizations to continue to champion youth and leadership across our organizations to bring in these new ideas and this new energy. And I think AGRF and the UN Food Systems Summit are working hard to really cultivate youth engagement in agriculture. I think we all need to be democratizing our data. The data that we have is an amazing resource that young entrepreneurs can use and leverage through apps and information platforms to make a real difference and to scale up. And I think collectively, we need to advocate for governments and funders and investors to prioritize agriculture to support the agricultural education, development, and innovations, as well as the basic infrastructure that's needed to create a more thriving agriculture sector. But personally, I think there are very exciting opportunities for this scaling up and for the next generation of youth. And my hope is that the next generation will grow this sector in brilliant ways that we can't yet imagine. Thanks, Jeff.
Absolutely. Nice one. Dr. Sadov, let me go back to Maine. And Dr. Robert Bertram, you just heard Dr. Sadov there saying the next generation of African farmers. Who are they? You mentioned women being the backbone of agriculture in Africa, but who are the next generation of African farmers?
Well, absolutely. We do need to underscore the role of women in African agriculture, and not just on farm, Jeff, but all through the marketing side of agriculture as well. And there's a lot we can do to work with women in ways that use some of the tools that have just been referred to in terms of access to market information, so that through cell phones and other means that allows them to be in a much better bargaining position than, say, their mothers and grandmothers were in terms of selling to traders. But I think the other thing that our minds go to immediately when you ask about the next generation is the young people. And Claudia just mentioned that the future is in the youth. And I think the key is going to be attracting them to roles in agriculture and the food system. So let's think holistically about that. It's not just on farm, but through all these knowledge intensive value chains. And we've talked about, there's some themes emerging in the discussion here. A lot of the places we're working are undercapitalized. People don't have access to irrigation. They don't have access to mechanization or threshers. Well, there are ways that young people are doing exciting work, often based through cell phone-based communication, to take capital equipment to communities, to farming communities, and allow them to collectively, with their neighbors, access a market that they hadn't been able to access before. Maybe it's land preparation, maybe it's irrigation, maybe it's harvesting. But by aggregating that demand, young people can help communities increase their incomes, and they can help cities by making more food, quality food, available and affordable. I think many of us have heard of the example of Hello Tractor, but we've been doing a lot of work with the CGIAR, with our US university partners, and with, most importantly, with our national public and private sector partners in Ethiopia, Ghana, Tanzania, and elsewhere, to see how we can make things like irrigation more affordable, especially, and more accessible to women. And the same thing is true in some of the agricultural equipment, where a smaller scale of equipment is much more gender friendly. So we look at the social science dimension of an innovation as well as the profitability. And returning to that profitability theme for a second, profitability and the ability to make money is what's going to attract the young people and keep them in agriculture. And it's especially in these high quality, nutritious foods that we want to see people eat more of: the fruits, the vegetables, the fish, the dairy, the meat, the eggs, the poultry. All of those are more knowledge intensive. They're more food safety intensive, again, linked to knowledge, but they're also profit intensive. So people will pay more for them. We want to make them more affordable, though, so it's a matter of lowering their real prices so that people can eat more of them by increasing the productivity. But that's a great opportunity, and I think that this diversified agriculture that's occurring in Africa is going to be key to meeting the growing needs for a diverse and quality diet amongst cities and in the rural areas. And importantly, Jeff, these foods are not the foods driving the negative dietary transition. They're not the sugars, they're not the fats. They're the quality foods, the nutritious foods that families and women in particular depend on to ensure the well-being of their children and their family.
Absolutely. Well put there, Doctor. Let me go to Dr. Gunhild Studalen. Now, you were listed among the 25 most influential female leaders shaping climate change in 2019. Congratulations for that. The question is it possible to make nutritious and healthy food available, accessible, and affordable without addressing climate change?
Well, in the short term, you could argue maybe, but in the medium and long term, absolutely no. Because as we heard from Claudia as well, I mean, food systems are not only a major source of emission, accounting for a quarter of the global greenhouse gas emissions, but food systems are also heavily impacted by climate change. And before COVID, conflict and climate change were the two biggest drivers of food insecurity in the world. And we are now facing our third year of increasing hunger in the world after more than a decade of steady decline. And climate change is also poised to continue to be the biggest driver of food insecurity during the next decade. And many African farmers, notably in the Sahel, already suffer from high crop failures, in large part due to shifting starts or false starts, and also increasing unpredictability of short and long rains. And some studies also suggest that increased concentrations of CO2 in the atmosphere actually yields less nutritious crops and also lower yields. So this is obviously a double whammy for those who already are struggling with acute hunger and undernutrition. And these are unacceptable trends 10 years short of delivering on the Sustainable Development Goals. But the good news here is that shifting to healthy and nutritious food production is not only climate compatible, but it can also be climate positive. And first, on the African continent, actions that increase productivity per hectare of a diversity of crops are a core element of addressing both climate change and biodiversity conservation. And second, keeping Africa's unique biodiversity and of course carbon dense forest intact is a second strategy here, though completely depending on closing yield gaps, of course. Third, preventing the rapid shift towards overconsumption of unhealthy food, which we especially see in urban areas and cities. And talking about then overconsumption of red meat, of sugar, salt, trans fats, especially. That is obviously critical both from a public health perspective, but also for environmental and climate reasons. And finally, given the booming population in Africa, trade will also be a core contribution to ensuring food and nutritional security and also halting then expansion of agricultural land into natural ecosystems. But those four actions combined can both secure a major part of Africa's contribution to climate change, at the same time averting the public health disaster that many African countries now are faced with. So in other words, such strategies are win-wins.
Dr. Claudia Sadov, let's stick on climate change, and I'll ask you, how do you see actors on the African region working together to overcome the prolonged droughts we're seeing and intensified rains in some parts, which is causing major climate change here? How do the actors come together? What do they do going forward?
Thanks, Jeff. This really will be a continued challenge across Africa because it is perhaps the most immediate way in which so many farmers and so many food systems are going to be feeling the impact of climate change. It will be through this really uncertain and unpredictable rains. As I mentioned before, because so many of the farmers, so much of the farmland in sub-Saharan Africa is rain-fed, the opportunity to the imperative to try to support small farmers in this context is one that is very pressing. And you ask who will be needed to come together? How do we work together to protect against this rainfall uncertainty and droughts? And it really will take the full range of expertise working across the sector, because the farmers will need better warnings and monitoring and information systems. So many of the speakers today have touched on the importance of data in terms of providing farmers with the information that they need to adapt. The good news here is that the technologies that we have, both the technologies that we have to make predictions about droughts and uncertain rainfall, and the technologies that we have to push that data and information directly to the geospatial section of farmers to which it applies, all of these technologies are moving forward very quickly. So these monitorings, warnings, and advisories are a really important group of professionals and entrepreneurs that will need to be involved. Similarly, we really do need to ensure that there is greater awareness and capacity for farmers to store water, because the unpredictability of rainfall isn't necessarily a lack of rainfall. In fact, this year we've had historic floods in sub-Saharan Africa, but the rains come at the wrong time. They come in the wrong places, and it's very difficult for farmers to store water. Again, 95% rain-fed farmers, they don't necessarily have access to reservoirs. But even farmers that can't be provided with, say, large-scale irrigation or reservoirs, there's so much that can be done in terms of storing moisture in soils, in terms of keeping healthy river basins and watersheds that will more regularly, that will help to regulate water across seasons. These sorts of issues can help farmers in managing the vagaries of rainfall, and that will involve land managers, it will involve soil scientists, foresters, and it will involve the institutions that allocate water to different users across, for example, water basins, river basins. So these sorts of efforts will require almost a full court press. So many of those involved in both helping to warn and prepare farmers for uncertainty, because what we can't predict, we still need to be resilient to. It really harkens back to this issue of how can we stabilize the inputs that are needed, water being one of them, the livelihoods, so that coping mechanisms can be drawn upon, coping both in terms of livelihoods and agricultural inputs, to stabilize the farming communities and the food systems and the food supplies that they provide throughout Africa, and importantly to the cities, which is the topic here today.
Absolutely.
Thanks, Jeff.
It comes back to Enoch. You know, what you said earlier on, there's just not enough data collection. Enoch, let's face it, back where you are from, you know when the rains are going to fall. You know when there's going to be a drought. And yet there's not enough effort to, as Dr. Sadov was saying, harvest the water, collect the water during the rainy season. There's not enough of that being done. Why not?
Well, looking at any investment, as you know, the key drivers really would be the government on the policy side, and then the private sector, that is the innovations. So we need to put in front of those institutions why it is important to focus on data and to start to invest now so that the decisions are more accurate. And I'm sure if you just run through, I mean, there is the World Bank report that has predicted that the consumer food market for Africa is going to be $1 trillion by 2030. And you look at that number, and I mean, I spend a lot of my time in the private sector. You want to understand how you tap into that. So say that's one data point. And then you go into another, data here, that today in Africa, you've got 250 million Africans who are considered hungry, but almost close to, or more than 900 million who cannot afford a high quality diet. So you have incentives on one hand, and also risks if you don't do anything about it. Mm. I'm just saying, putting this in front of government and private sector should be compelling enough to start to look at data and building those platforms that will be providing the decisions that are important at policy level as well as at investment level. The good news is that we have a new collaboration underway, which is involving several partners working with FAO and the World Bank to conduct annual surveys of smallholder farmers across 50 low-income countries by 2030. Mm. And we call it the 50 by 2030 Data Smart Agriculture Initiative. And then among many things which they are trying to achieve is to try to strengthen the linkage, collaboration between the ministries of agriculture and the National Statistical Office. This institution exists in one country, but often they don't even talk to each other. So the idea of the 50 by 2030 Data Smart Agriculture Initiative is to try to build connectivity between what happens in agriculture and also the urban consumers. And the good news also is that there are 15 countries which are pre-selected, 10 of which are already in Africa today. They include Burkina Faso, Ethiopia, Ghana, Kenya, and so on. And so these insights that will be generated is then will become the key drivers of targeted investments that are critical through the private sector, and also to be determined which are the value chains that are critical to be developing in the next 10 years, so that they can now be in response to that demand, which is again predicted. Other good news is that we also have now tools that enable us to do that. As Dr. Claudia said, we have digital platforms, satellite data, but central to this is not just collecting data. It is the ability to analyze and then generate insights out of it. And as you know, if you are starting from poor data, it will lead to poor decisions. So there are principles here and some of the practices which are helping really governments, even after the completion of the 50 by 2030. We are going to be having all these data sets that then require analytics to generate the insights that will then inform decisions. So we are seeing countries now beginning to invest in machine learning, artificial intelligence, which means data science is becoming very, very, very important. Yeah. It's not just important to be collecting all this data, you need to analyze it, and then it will tell you what to do. As they often say, what gets measured gets done. So very, very important, we're at that inflection point where we have all these tools that can now help us to make informed decisions and making those interconnections, especially what happens in agriculture and also the consumer demand.
Absolutely. What gets measured gets done. Dr. Robert Bertram, the USAID has a strong expertise in mapping and monitoring vulnerable groups to make sure aid reaches the most in need. Could you share with us some of the best practices and lessons learned?
Thanks, Jeff. Yes, you're absolutely right. And I would say that part of this reflects the fact that USAID is both a development donor, as we've been discussing this morning, but we've also had a role with humanitarian assistance, of course, for many years, and it's a major part of our undertakings. So understanding where the need is a critical thing. We do have systems in place to try to address acute needs. Some of you might have heard of FuseNet, the Famine Early Warning System. But I think your question, Jeff, is really getting at some of the more chronic underlying needs that we see in Africa in many rural areas. And for that, we really need better data on where poor people are, where undernutrition is concentrated. And as I said earlier, we tend to see that concentrated in the rural areas, but very unfortunately, it's also in cities. And of course, in both settings, this is exacerbated. These problems in nutrition are exacerbated by poor sanitation and hygiene standards. So that's one of the other big areas we work on. And of course, we want these to converge, led by our national partners, to really provide the healthy environment. But I'd like to say a bit more about what do we do about this? And Enoch made the point about, we have policy, and then we have private sector. So policy can, if we do things right, we can take away some of the risks to investment. We can reduce checkpoints. We can try to enhance trade. We can open up the ability for people to access mobile money so that finance can move from urban to rural areas. So there's many things in that space. But the other big opportunity here is profitability to attract private investments. So they're going to want less risk and greater transparency. And I think so policy has a key role to play, but so does innovation. And I think all the speakers today have mentioned innovation. And I think what we want to do ideally is increase the productive potential and profitable potential by reduce risk, and then drive in investment, especially from the private sector, on farm and off, in ways that are going to really help raise all boats. And we have some evidence just from last year, actually, from the World Bank, that agricultural growth, especially in poor countries in Africa, is up to 4 times more effective at reducing the burden of extreme poverty. And that's in both rural and urban settings. And as we heard earlier today, that's also linked to child stunting. So income remains very important, income poverty, in terms of being able to access a healthier environment, quality diet, and so forth. Last point I'd like to make in this regard, it's just picking up on some of the other speakers, is that, when we get these things right, we see the growth. We see, earlier today, people were talking about the hidden middle. It's actually huge. It tends to be hidden, but people are entering into these markets. They are entering into these opportunities in ways that connect rural areas with urban needs and demands. So I remain optimistic, and I think if we do it right, in terms of smartly, climate smart, resource use efficiency, we can bring our environmental objectives, our climate resilient objectives, and our profitability objectives for smallholders and the private sector investors all along the value chain to come together in ways that sustainably nourish the continent.
Dr. Gunhild Stordalen, like Dr. Bertram said, are we getting it right? Are we?
Well, things are getting better, but overall, we are not even close to do what is needed, given that the time is running out. We have less than 10 years, according to the science, and in 2030, we should be eradicating hunger and ensuring health for all, and protecting land and oceans, etc. But I think we have all reasons to be optimistic here. The Eat Lancet report, which came out last year, was the first integrated assessment of what is healthy diets from sustainable food systems. And it actually shows that it is possible to feed a growing world population, reaching 10 billion people by 2050, enough healthy food within safe planetary boundaries. And as a follow-up on that report, the Food and Land Use Coalition did another assessment and showed that it is actually possible to shift to healthy, sustainable food for all, and doing so in a way that benefits the farmers and rural economies, and also the consumers, and can save massive costs at the societal level, as well as generate up to $4.5 trillion in new business opportunities every year by 2030. So getting it right on food is, I believe, the single most powerful medicine for people and planet. And it is doable, but we need to act on the best available science. We need to break down silos and work together like never before. And if we are able to define a global common agenda with multiple objectives, we can actually deliver on it.
Yeah, Dr. Claudia Seedorf, I'm going to ask you the same question. Are we getting it right?
And my answer will be similar to Dr. Stordalen's as well. We can get it right. We have the resources, we have the knowledge, we have the dedication and the vision, but there's still so much to do. I think one of the interesting aspects of the discussion that we're having today with this focus on cities is the fact that as we see these cities grow, as we see the scale of these cities, the number of megacities across the world, it changes the spatial relationship between cities and rural spaces, because those cities are pulling in so many resources and they're putting out so much waste? How can we ensure that the relationship between the urban and rural centers really create a much more circular, efficient, healthful system of food, land, water, and waste? We need to begin to really reimagine that. If we become a world with dozens of megacities over 10 million people, no matter how water rich that space might have been, no matter how rich an agricultural area that city may have been born into, at that scale, things need to be rethought. And the dynamism that those cities offer, we need to put the effort into ensuring they thrive. The risks, for example, with COVID, the health risks, the risks of societal cohesion when you have that many people together that all have needs and all have dreams and aspirations. We need to make sure that our cities are healthy, thriving places. And for that, we need to make sure that they're working in concert with the rural areas that provide them food that may absorb the waste. We need to do this mindful of planetary boundaries. We need to do it mindful of the cost of transport. It's not just a question of flying things in from all over the world, because there are climate impacts and cost implications for poor consumers that are associated with that. So a lot of what we need to do is rethink these rural-urban food systems that are strongly anchored in robust land and water systems, ones that take full account of the hazards of waste, the potential of recycling not just of plastics and papers like we usually think, but the recycling of the nutrients and the water and the energy that are in wastewater and food waste. How can we really create much more healthful circular economies that will allow these urban centers to thrive within a stable, resilient, and sustainable, broader urban-rural ecosystem?
Yeah.
Thanks, Jeff.
Enoch Chikava. Yeah, go ahead, Dr. Studholm, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to follow up on what you just said, Claudia, and cities not only being incredibly powerful and important drivers of rural change, but cities is where the future happens first, and we now from EAT see that in real time. We have a collaboration with the C40 Cities Network, which has 93 of the biggest cities around the world, and 50 of these cities, including 11 African megacities, have now joined an urban food systems network. And these cities, 14 of these cities have signed a Good Food Cities Declaration, where they have actually committed to deliver and implement the targets from the Eat Lancet Commission report by 2030. So it's really inspiring to see how they are setting bold scientific or science-based targets, and now are working across the municipality with private sector, learning from each other through this C40 Cities network on improving access and availability of healthy, sustainable food, reducing food waste, etc. So I think we have a lot to learn from cities in general, and seeing how they are piloting the new sustainable way forward.
Yeah, Dr. Robert Bertram, I see you nodding your head vigorously there. You agree?
Yes, Jeff, I do. I think the only thing I would add to what Gunhild just said would be that large cities play a very important role in driving that demand, and it's a huge opportunity that has been referred to several times. But secondary cities are also coming into their own, and they offer very important pathways for both wealth generation, pathways out of poverty. And we know that, one of the beautiful things, I mentioned the agricultural growth, it impacts not just people in rural areas, but also in urban areas. That's what that World Bank study last year showed. The poorest people in all areas. And why is that? Because it drives demand for locally produced goods and services. So a lot of people who are very poor, maybe even people who don't have land, they can step into a job, maybe not an agricultural job, maybe it is in tailoring or shoe repair or equipment servicing, cell phone kiosks, you name it. But this kind of growth is critical. And I think, as Claudia said, it's having this holistic approach that spans the environmental, nutritional, and economic needs of cities, and places them in that context where smaller cities and towns, all the way to the most remote rural areas, are connected. And again, I know some of the earlier speakers today talked about the importance of infrastructure. I think we're seeing the benefits of that. Slowly in Africa. It's incremental, but it's really happening. And we saw what happened when we can leapfrog with like cell phone technology. But as we get other kinds of infrastructure, I think that's going to be a positive thing for bringing urban investment not into international out of country opportunities, but more and more into profitable opportunities in their own countries. And last point on that is we're seeing that happen a lot in Africa. We're seeing people who might have moved to a city, but still have land or family in a rural area, reinvesting in that rural area. And there's some really interesting work coming out of Tom Jane and others' work at Michigan State that shows that if those farms are in the sort of 5 to 10 hectares, which are larger than their poor neighbors, that is a sweet spot for spillover of technologies, of information, of knowledge about pests and diseases, or what the market is demanding, or again, it's about connection. And so I see a lot of positives here. It doesn't take away from the challenges. Gunhild is absolutely right. We've got a long way to go, but I think if we use science and if we use transparent policies that incentivize banks to lend and take risks and be able to quantify those risks, we have a good way forward.
Absolutely. Enoch Chikava, you heard Dr. Sadov a moment ago saying, we have the vision, we have the knowledge, we have the dedication right here on the continent. Simple question is, what's the missing link?
Yeah, there are a few missing pieces, and I think I'll just also allude to the fact that Africa right now, through the CADAP, especially from the agricultural point of view, if you read that document, it is very, very detailed in terms of the vision itself, in terms of the goals. As you know, it started all the way in Maputo 2003 and then Malabo 2014. Very, very clear plan. I think what's needed is now to put these plans into action, which again, in Africa, at times it's very hard to continue policies because elections happen every 5 years and so on, and then the new administration and so on. But so it is more of the implementation that is needed. And you cannot just wait for government to do everything. That's where the role of private sector becomes very, very, very important. And also dividing the roles here, the role of government is to provide an enabling environment so that private sector can thrive. Going back to the right policies, making sure that we can democratize data, making sure that we have the right policies, there is open data, there is fair principles on how you collect your data and then analyze it. Once you provide these global goods, which are open to innovators, then you see private sector, which has even much more money and access to capital, coming into the countries. And I think it is understanding that to make sure that the role of government is to create that enabling environment, but we need to allow private sector to do what they do best. Mm-hmm. When they see opportunities, like I refer to another previous data point, $1 trillion in consumer food, it's attractive, but it is attractive before you get into the country. When you get to the country, it's like, whoa, there's still some other things to be done. So I believe the biggest opportunity that we have through, again, the CADEP mechanism, through the Africa 2063, we have the right pieces. And I don't think we can get all the 55 countries going at the same pace. But we are beginning to see countries which are already moving the needle. As you know, from the biannual review process, which is a process by the African Union, we have 4 countries that are really moving the needle in the right direction. We have some of the indicators, some countries are sliding back and so on. But at least that mechanism where leaders can devote some time to say, can we come up with a way of evaluating whether we are moving forward or not? So I really compliment, coming up with that scorecard. And then every 2 years, you see it, are we making progress or not? But also learning from each other. I'm very much inspired. I've been spending some time in India and so on, and find that there are a lot of good things happening, especially on the innovation side. And you need to come up with these super platforms, where you can now begin to build much broader platforms. The challenge we have today in Africa is that we have data which is sitting in silos. You've got one private sector reaching only 10,000. And then there is a multiplicity of different disaggregated platforms. What we need is to come up with a much bigger platform where everyone can hook onto. And as you know, in India, they have this unique ID, which is a mechanism of identifying where the people are in the urban areas, in the rural areas. And then you're using this biometric, system. Now that has become a platform for innovation. We are now layering services on top of that. You're bringing in insurance, you're bringing in credit, you're bringing in, irrigation, where irrigation is needed and so on. You can link that to the market as well, because you know exactly where production is. You know where there is a demand. So beginning to move towards national driven platforms is something that we may need to be thinking about. And then in India, they call them the agri-stack or the agricultural node. And we have a project in Ethiopia that we have started also, in the past 2 years. That's looking at the digital extension, benefiting from the 60,000 extension officers. Some of them were trained a couple of years ago, and you need to make sure that you're providing them with the latest information, real-time information, telling farmers, before you produce, this is what the market is telling you. So the ability to do that at scale is, I think, what we need to be thinking about. And then digital innovation, machine learning that we talked about can start to achieve things at scale.
And speaking of that
so
scorecard,
we can move from these small use cases and pilots into a national level impact that will drive the transformation.
Absolutely. And speaking of that scorecard, Rwanda voted #1 by the African Union, #1 on the continent. That says something. Dr. Strudalen, you wanted to say something? I saw your hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to build on what Enoch said about, data is one thing which we absolutely need. But another thing is also tools to inform better decision-making for policymakers, but also investors. And right now, there is a lot of investment going into the bad things, bad for people, bad for planets. The Food and Land Use Coalition report indicated that the current externalities of the food system, if we look across health, climate, environment, and social inequalities, it exceeds the value that the food system brings and generates to the global economy by $2 trillion a year. But no one is seeing all these externalities and the cost of damage from the food system on one budget. So that's why EAT, together with the Food and Land Use Coalition, as well as the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research, now have convened a commission of 20 world-leading economists and experts to look into what is the cost of inaction versus cost of action, and also look into what policies do and do not work to support the shift to a healthy, sustainable, equitable food system. And I strongly believe that that will have huge value also to get both public but also private investment fueled into the new food economy, and correcting the policy failure, something like that with solid, rigorous evidence will be really valuable to help better policies and regulations that actually makes it profitable also for private companies to produce and serve better food and food products.
All right, folks, we've got a few minutes left. I'd like some closing thoughts. Remember, keep in mind the theme for this year's Africa Green Revolution Forum, Feed the Cities, Grow the Continent. We're going to begin in San Francisco. Dr. Sadoff, closing thoughts going forward.
Thank you, Jeff. I think the discussion here and the discussion across the AGRF so far is so interesting because it's a very contextualized discussion that I'm so happy that is being had. We have been unavoidably speaking about Africa's challenges in the context of the COVID pandemic. And I think this really drives home so importantly the fundamental challenge of the resilience of our food systems and how seriously we have to take that. And framing that discussion around resilience also necessarily puts it squarely in the context of, say, climate change and planetary boundaries, and the imperative of sustainability, and the need that we have to anchor these food systems so holistically within the land and water and natural resource systems in which they operate, and the social and economic and administrative systems in which they operate. And this panel and the AGRF more broadly really has focused as well on drawing this line of sight between food and cities. And it's invited us to look very carefully at just how complex and fundamental the relationship between urban and rural spaces is, and how fundamental the relationship between food systems and broader economic systems and economic dynamism, how truly fundamental that is, how much this matters for urban and rural well-being, for inclusive growth, for poverty, for the opportunity of all people for inclusive growth. And it's helping us to reimagine these relationships between urban-rural food systems and their centrality to climate responses, to resilience, to sustainability, to human health, human productivity, human dignity as well. At the CG, we're in the process of a reform moment, and we have actually reformulated our primary mandate. And our primary mandate now very much reflects this need for a holistic systems approach. Our mandate is to end hunger by 2030, in line with the SDGs, through science to transform food, land, and water systems in a climate crisis. And it is this complex of challenges in which food systems are so central that we need to appreciate as we move forward, because the challenges of cities, of growth, of opportunity, as well as the biophysical challenges of a sustainable food system in a planet with true boundaries that we are now experiencing, is one that really needs to be achieved together. So I appreciate the opportunity to be here, and I've learned so much today. Thanks.
Absolutely, as have we. From San Francisco, let's go to Maine, from coast to coast. Dr. Robert Bertram.
Well, Jeff, I guess I'd start by saying what we're talking about today, nourishing Africa, and especially its cities, meeting the needs of its cities, is a must-have for sustainable development. We have to have the rural areas of Africa step up to meet the demands for the diverse, nutritious, safe foods that people in cities at all income levels are seeking and should eat. So that has to happen. I think if we do it right, the path towards that through those rural areas will also broaden urbanization so that it's not just megacities, but we see secondary cities emerging in ways that take some of the pressure off those primary cities that have grown so quickly, and shift more of that economic opportunity for rural people when they step out of agriculture to step to a nearby city or town in ways that will be socially and environmentally more feasible than some of the challenges we see in megacities. And it's a more equitable future that we can think about, but we need investment in innovation to drive that investment from both the public and private sectors. We need science and technology. We need digital tools. We need democratic access, including for women and youth, to some of the benefits of a knowledge-driven economy that encompasses food and agriculture. So the role of science and technology in getting us to that more inclusive, sustainable future is critical. And finally, Jeff, I just say that we have global challenges that are critical, but it's not one size fits all. So we know that in countries like mine, maybe people should be eating less animal source foods, but we also know that many places where we work in Africa, people eat meat maybe once a year. And we see the devastating impacts of an inadequate diet without these critical micronutrients and proteins. So let's keep this triple burden in view. And as I said earlier, a lot of the things we can do to address undernutrition and extreme poverty will also help improve diet quality for those at risk of overconsumption of sugars or fats or other things that lead to the tremendous challenges associated with non-communicable diseases. We do have a win-win pathway forward here, and it's through urban and rural areas being connected.
All right, well put there, Doctor. From Maine to Oslo, and it looks like Dr. Stu Darlin has a friend there right next to her. Go ahead.
Yeah. No, I think most is said, but I would just again stress the importance of cities in driving this shift. And we know that some 80% of food in the future will be served in urban areas, and that cities are agile and they are able to pilot and pioneer new solutions and also new ways of working together. And by the time of next year's Food Systems Summit, we have a real unique historic opportunity to forge a shared agenda. Obviously global thinking, but local solutions. And a lot of this has to happen bottom up. And I think the beauty of food is that there are so many win-wins. If we get it right on food, it can be our most powerful medicine to improve health, tackle climate change, protect the environment, create prosperous, resilient societies and economies. And it's something that everybody cares about. It affects all of us, and the one thing maybe that we as humanity share. So I really believe that we can bring the world together and force new ways of working together towards the Food Systems Summit and towards 2030. Thank you.
Absolutely. All the way from Oslo to one of my favorite cities, Seattle, Washington. Enoch Chikava, take it home.
Thank you, Jeff. Just to say again, this AGRF for 2020 is taking place at a very, very critical time. It is when we have this health pandemic, when we have locusts in East Africa, and we are still grappling with the impact of climate change. And we all know that some of the pandemics and locusts we can resolve maybe in the short to medium term. But also when it comes to climate change, we need to think for the long term. And some of those actions, they have to take place a lot earlier. Otherwise it becomes too late for us to do anything about it. So I would say this conference is taking place at this important juncture. But also what I've been hearing, even yesterday, today, is really this relationship between urban and rural, private sector and public sector, and at times import versus local production. And I think the point here is not is not one or the other. It is going to be both. We need to look at this in a very holistic way. And I think if we have learned anything from the pandemic, the COVID pandemic, it is that our systems are weak. Our systems need strengthening. It is just showing how fragile our systems are. And I think this is the wake-up call in terms of how much we need to come together in a very, very broad way to make sure that we begin to look at these challenges, but also coming up with solutions. This is all happening when we can do things a lot better than any other time in history because of innovation. Even the thought of us talking across the world like this is the power of innovation. And I think we can apply the same in agriculture. We can still apply the same in cities. We can apply the same in nutrition. It is the power of innovation. And going back to my earlier point, data tells you what to do or what not to do. And I think right now we just accumulate data. Some of it, you can't use it. I think that's an area where we need to spend a lot of time. What do we know about our challenges? How can we solve them better? Who has done it much better than others? There are always great lessons for us to learn. And I've seen even, as you know, I come from Africa and so on. If Ethiopia does something right, or it is just Ethiopia. If Rwanda does something like, oh, it is just Rwanda, it's a small country. I think here's an opportunity for us to learn what works, and then we can amplify that. And I think there are nuggets of best practices in Africa today. And I think the challenges we have will require us to move into another paradigm where we can begin to be more inclusive. That's why, again, in the foundation, we are led by this very strong belief that all lives have equal value, regardless of where they are born. Even those people in slums, they deserve nutritious food as much as I do. Those smallholder farmers, they want and desire the same things as they want. So how can we make it a better place? That we need to follow the data. And I think we have that opportunity for us to begin to invest. I think those countries who are investing actively right now, like what we're saying in India, they are making progress. This is time for Africa. So I'm very happy that we are talking about these things, and yeah, we are making progress. And this AGRF is very, very important to be moving in the right direction.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Enoch. Enoch Chikava there, Dr. Gunhild Studalen, Dr. Robert Bertram, Dr. Claudia Sadoff. Thank you so much for being part of Red Threads today. Really appreciate your input. Really appreciate you being here tonight. Thank you very much. And that has been Red Threads for day 2. Remember, Red Threads will continue tomorrow, same time, 6:15 Kigali time tomorrow evening. But in the meantime, tomorrow morning, join us on Good Morning AGRF, 10 a.m. Kigali time. And then in the afternoon, there's a youth town hall. Please join us for that. It'll all be online. And keep tweeting, keep messaging us, keep letting us know your thoughts and your comments. The handle is @AGRF 2020. And the hashtags, first one is Feed the Cities. And then hashtag Grow the Continent, hashtag Virtual Summit. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Jeff Koinange. Good night from Kigali.